Welcome to Bitcoin Fixes This, where we explore the impact that Bitcoin will have in all aspects of society. Today's guest is Pete Rizzo, reporter, editor, and Bitcoin historian. We talk about altcoins, and specifically his article on Forbes arguing against them. Pete tells us about his thinking in writing the article, the importance of moral arguments, and his pivot to historically documenting Bitcoin. Pete Rizzo, welcome back. How's everything going?
Good, man. Thanks for having me. Stirring up stuff on Bitcoin Twitter as usual.
Indeed you are. You have a fairly controversial, or what I thought would be controversial, article on Forbes against cryptocurrency, the ethical argument for Bitcoin maximalism. Now, for those people that haven't read the article, can you kind of summarize it for us?
Yeah, sure. I'll just give a quick introduction to myself. So yeah, Pete Rizzo, been a cryptocurrency journalist going on 9 years since 2013 when I stumbled into the space. Originally was, sort of the founding editor over at CoinDesk, now editor over at Bitcoin Magazine, and editor at large at the Kraken Cryptocurrency Exchange. So, no stranger to the space, been around and seen the evolutions. Yeah, I guess in terms of this article, what I was really trying to get across was, one, I've been looking for kind of an explanation for why I've been increasingly interested in focusing my work on Bitcoin only in a way to, broadcast that to more people, right? So I think that was one of the goals for me for sure. I think the other goals were mostly chipping away at what I would call this sort of idea that, it's okay to be neutral or agnostic to the cryptocurrency market. So I think this is something that we particularly encounter with people who are outside of the Bitcoin community. Myself, I see this in the journalism community, the investor space, this idea that all these cryptocurrencies are the same. They're essentially all different, like stocks and bonds. There's nothing really different about any of these things. And therefore, it's okay for you, or it's actually morally correct for you to have a neutral outlook on it, right? Why wouldn't you be neutral to cryptocurrencies? So there's almost this assumed neutrality on the space, right? Where if you have an opinion or you do have a thesis that one currency, let's just say in this case, Bitcoin, is better than the others, you must be carrying some sort of an inherent bias because, to be unbiased, that would be neutral. So I think it really started with that, right? Is just chipping away at this idea that I saw where, that I just increasingly sort of felt was untrue, right? I think for a while, I think it was true that, Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, were new and novel. And I just think we know a lot more about them now. And I would argue, I think at this juncture of where we are in understanding, the phenomenon, which I think is really the only way to kind of class the whole thing, is that we know enough to know that I think Bitcoin has properties that ensure user rights to a higher degree than other cryptocurrencies. And I think that was the argument that I was trying to put out there.
Yeah, and you bring up a really good point because a lot of reporters, I think that it's very neutral to sort of like not have a favorite cryptocurrency, though. So they'll treat Dogecoin the same way they would Bitcoin and pretend they're at like sort of the same level.
Yeah, I think it's a failure of education, right? And it's a failure of that profession to adequately respond to the task of covering the field, right? So I'll just, state bluntly that when I started as a journalist in 2013, obviously the barrier to entry was a lot lower, right? My first article about Bitcoin was about a local restaurant in Massachusetts that accepted Bitcoin, right? So there wasn't anything special or novel that I was writing other than, Bitcoin was being used as a payment method in this case, right? So I think there isn't really any specific knowledge you need to be Bitcoin or cryptocurrency journalist. In a lot of cases, these are kids who are fresh out of school, never had a writing job. That was certainly, defined me. And, it's not like early on, as I am now, where I spend a lot of my time on the Bitcoin talk forums and asking kind of questions about the technology. That wasn't really encouraged, right? It was find the next story. Who's the next big merchant that's going to accept Bitcoin? What are famous people saying about Bitcoin, right? There's this sort of surface level, sort of intellectual idea of what news is, right? And it sort of never gets questioned, right? It's just, and you can see that even today, right? Big VC says something about Bitcoin. Oh, well, he's a big VC, so he must know what he's talking about, right? So again, you sort of have this idea that it's neutral, you should be neutral to cryptocurrencies. And then I would say even deeper than that, I think there's this second order assumption that's also problematic, is that the cryptocurrency market itself is a functioning mediator between cryptocurrencies. So I think it's two things. It's like one, that they're all neutral. And I think it's two, it's that like the cryptocurrency market itself is actually giving us meaningful data about what's going on, right? And combined, I think when you actually tease those two things apart, you start to understand the assumptions that are driving, quote, the mainstream lens on Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. And I think it's important to start there, right? For many people, whatever it is that we're talking about here, it starts with them logging on to CoinMarketCap every day, or Masari, or something like that.
Yeah, so you bring up a bunch of good points there. But one thing that I wanted to drill a little deeper on is your sort of assertion that a lot of reporters in this space, and probably in others, to be quite frank, they only really look at the surface level, and they just want, I guess, a lot of clicks. They're under pressure to produce a lot of stories, so the publication has lots of them. Would you say there's an incentive problem there? What's going on? Why don't they do more deep dives as you've been doing the last year or so?
Well, I mean, look, it took me a long time, right? It took me, I think, being in the right places, asking the right questions, and then being confronted with information that I didn't quite understand. I think that it's important to maintain empathy with people, right? I think that most people are trying to do the right thing. They're trying to do a good job, right? But it's really larger sort of systemic things that often fail, right? So I think, when I interact with the journalism community these days, I try to be more forward in saying, I support Bitcoin only. I've been here for 8 years, and I actually think the only interesting things that are going on Bitcoin, and here's why. And a lot of people don't follow up and sort of ask me about that argument. Some do, right? So in response to this piece, I actually did get a number of other journalists kind of back channeling and sort of asking me a little bit more, about my position. I had a really great chat with the editor over at the Block, and, he is somebody I've been trying to get on this argument for a while. And it seemed like he, had progressed further. I think you just have to give people time, right? In the same way that people gave me time, right? I wasn't always someone who understood, things to the level I did now. And it took people arguing with me, yelling with me, and answering questions, and sort of trying to adjust the frame and lens that I was looking at things, right? I think that's all you can do. I don't know if there's anything more than the hand-to-hand combat. And then otherwise just making arguments, right? And I think it's also important to understand that as Bitcoin evangelists, we are making arguments, and some of our arguments are not super effective, right? So when I was writing this article, I actually think I've developed a loose framework, right? Where I think there's really essentially all arguments for Bitcoin maximalism. You can kind of divide them into essentially, I'd say 4 or 5 buckets, right? So there's economic arguments for Bitcoin. Bitcoin is the best money. You could look at the proper properties of money and see that Bitcoin, has more of these properties, or has properties in a better way than other monies. There's this idea that Bitcoin is a better network. It's the most decentralized. The cost of running the node is the lowest. There's all sorts of different metrics that you can use to quantify that. You can look at the launch. Bitcoin relied on conditions that won't repeat again. You have this immaculate conception idea. And then you have this, concept that I think you were actually one of the first people to really talk about and introduce, is that Bitcoin is sort of aligned to human rights, or liberal values, or something that we would consider morally good, right? That it's somehow, we as humans are biased towards expanding our own rights and capabilities. And Bitcoin is actually ensuring those at a higher level than other technologies, right? So that Bitcoin actually isn't something that you should support, inherently. You should support Bitcoin because it better aligns with the values that you already support. And I think that's the most powerful argument for me, because I think when you look at the economic, the network, and the launch arguments, it's not really always clear why you can't measure these things, or that other cryptocurrencies aren't always already competing with Bitcoin on these things, right? When you clone a cryptocurrency, let's just say Dogecoin, you brought up that example. Dogecoin shares many of the same properties as Bitcoin, right? As money, right? And if you were to actually grade Bitcoin and Dogecoin in terms of the properties of money, right? Just by being a terrible copy of Bitcoin, you're immediately something that shares a lot of its properties, right? So I think it's hard for people to understand those arguments. They become very comparative, where I feel like the moral argument for Bitcoin is actually stronger, because you're basically saying you should be aligned with Bitcoin because it is actually doing something that you as a human being should already think is good. And therefore, the more you try to understand that or shape your world in that way, the more you'll find that Bitcoin is something that you should support. And I think that was the argument that was most effective for me. I mean, certainly I didn't, I've read economic textbooks since finding Bitcoin, but I don't know if any of them really would have convinced me on their own, that Bitcoin is somehow better, right? I wasn't looking for that. I wasn't someone who's coming from it from a perspective of caring about economics or money, in the same way that some people who care about economics and money just inherently care about those things, right? So I think, I would become very reliant on the economic arguments for Bitcoin. I would become very reliant on the network arguments for Bitcoin, that Bitcoin is more decentralized than these other things. And I ultimately just don't think they connect with people. people. I think they could be right and also, just ineffective in terms of helping people understand why Bitcoin is something that should matter to them.
Well, it's interesting because you titled this the ethical argument for Bitcoin. And ultimately, the argument that you end up making is that, fiat money is controlled by, the Federal Reserve, central banks, or some oligarchy of people that kind of controls everything within that money. And you basically argue that it's kind of like this rule by majority for a lot of these cryptocurrencies. Can you describe that a little bit better?
Yeah, thank you. That's something that took me a long time to try to figure out. So I think what I ultimately tried to get to with this is that, again, just sort of describing behaviors, right? So you have the idea that if Bitcoin is moral, if it does ensure rights, then what are those rights, right? And I think in Bitcoin, you end up thinking about things like you have the irrevocable right to your money, right? That's pretty foundational. You have the right to review and propose code. You have the right to validate transactions and economic rules. You have the right to the known money supply and predictable issuance of that money. And then this is the more complicated one, but I think you have the right to dissent from the majority within Bitcoin. I think that's, if I could spew out a rough Bitcoin Bill of Rights, I think it's roughly those things, right? These are the things that we think Bitcoin gives. And then if you look at the other cryptocurrencies, you start to ask the questions, well, it's like, to what extent do they also uphold those rights? And I think one of the interesting things becomes, like, the more you look at other cryptocurrencies, I think the more that you find that they are willing to, and this is the wording I think here, like, I use very carefully, is it's almost like they seem very willing to replace the authority of government within money, right? Start with fiat, and fiat governments are endowed with the authority to create and issue money on the basis that we elect these officials and they're acting in our interests, right? That's sort of the starting basis point. Bitcoin innovated on that by giving individuals the right to this known money supply and the right to be able to audit it and to then participate in that economy. So then what do other cryptocurrencies do, right? And the most that I think I can say is that they seem to be okay giving up these rights to the market, or almost putting the market in a place where, rather than a government guaranteeing your rights, the market guarantees your rights. And I would just say that I don't know enough to have a sophisticated opinion on that, because it took me a long time to get to the place where I think I can actually state that. But I do think it's different, right? If in Bitcoin you have an absolute guarantee that when you have a Bitcoin, right, when you own Bitcoin and you go into a coma for 100 years, or let's just say you're Hal Finney, you're cryogenically frozen. When you wake up, you're going to have access to your Bitcoin, right? That is the level of the irrevocable right to money that you have in Bitcoin. And again, is that present in other cryptocurrencies? I think the answer is no, because when you look at how they function, they oftentimes seem as though they operate where, majorities can form, and then majorities then can impose their will on others for certain things. So you have to kind of go back to historical examples, and I'm happy to do that and to why this is the case. But I think oftentimes when observing other cryptocurrencies, you find that they operate in such a way where, changes are made by a majority coming together, and then a majority actually invalidating the rights of those other people. And in those cases, how you would technically refer to this is, if there's a fork, right? If there is some people who are, continuing on one version of the cryptocurrency, and other people who are essentially left with the option to economically, continue in some other way, right? To try to, continue the original chain, they're sort of being forced to, bear the cost of that, right? That you can't really say that they are. It's questionable, I think, whether they are being endowed with any choice in that situation. So again, I think, not to get too technical at the beginning, but I think in Bitcoin, the way that the system has evolved, we have developed in such a way where when we make upgrades to Bitcoin, the majority does need to form, and the majority of people do need to actually enact a feature, but the minority doesn't actually have to follow. And I think that's something that absolutely does not exist in other cryptocurrencies. And it's actually really worth thinking about, because I think dramatically changes these types of systems, right? So when you look at claims like Ethereum is money, or that other cryptocurrencies are competing against Bitcoin, they start to seem really starkly different to me when you look at it from the lens of user rights. Because again, when you look at it from the lens of economics, it's hard to make it clear why that matters to someone, right? So Bitcoin has a finite 21 million supply. Okay, maybe Ethereum doesn't. Maybe that's their choice. And so maybe people who don't care can use Ethereum. Sure. But I think that becomes a very nihilistic argument, especially when those people aren't really understanding that they're trading the right to something that they have in Bitcoin, and they are entering a financial system in which there are weaker rights. So I think to your question about why does this matter is I think, Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies are ultimately systems that, enforce some form of user rights, and you can call those financial rights. And I think if you feel strongly about rights, you should probably want to support systems in which, humans have more rights. And you should be, more suspectful of systems where people have less rights. And I think that's, to me, a more moral lens to look at the industry.
Yeah. So this reminds me of sort of like forms of government or something like that. And I guess this is kind of what we're talking about because, pretty much every coin other than Bitcoin has some form of governance that sort of like decides on the rules of the coin. But I mean, would you say that this is something like, journalists, treating communism and democracy the same way and saying, oh, I want to be neutral. I'm not for either one or something like that. Like, does feel something like that to me, the way you're describing it.
Yeah, I think so. And I actually had a passage in here that was more kind of about using the communism democracy analogy. And I know that was something we've talked about. And I think why the communism democracy analogy makes sense is because I think people understand that within political systems, the nature of the structure of the systems like dictates their relationship between the individual and that nation, state, or body, right? So I think it's an example that really works because people understand it pretty intuitively, right? There's a relationship to power, and people, again, like we've grown up as children, and a lot of the stories that we read are about relationships to power, whether that's religion or whether stories that we read about, folk tales, like most of them have some sort of like king type structure, and we grow up learning about how democracy is formed, at least if you're, in a Western country. So I think people are very familiar with the idea that, you as a citizen have some relationship to power, right? So, you could argue then sort of, could you possibly be neutral on political systems? And I think most people would actually argue you can. Like, and why can't you be agnostic to political systems is because, their nature of those systems is such that, they put the user or the individuals participating in them in some situation where, their rights or freedoms are influenced by that system, right? And I think most people are inherently very biased towards Western-style democracies. I mean, I think that's where a lot of the initial hesitance towards Bitcoin as an idea even comes from, right? And I think there's a part of this article that, says essentially there's sort of three viewpoints. There's the Bitcoin maximalists, there's the cryptocurrency agnostics, and the Bitcoin deniers. And I think that from the standpoint of the Bitcoin deniers, I mean, I think their argument has always been pretty clear, right? They just don't think the private market should issue money, or that anyone should issue money, or there should be any money issuance outside of government. And they think that the democratic process works and that elected officials represent people. And therefore, that system to them is fair and moral. So, kind of looking at it through that lens, you can kind of sympathize with the Steve Hankeys and other people who, even though their arguments are pretty terrible, they sort of come at it, at least their worldview is like very clear, right? And helpful because it's very well defined, right? So Bitcoin is clearly not that, right? And in Bitcoin, we know that we are joining a new financial system. You're opting out and you're opting into that financial system. And, we're never going to revoke that right. So again, anyway, I think like back to the communism argument, again, it starts to be a useful way to look at these systems, right? Because again, people are not inherently neutral to political systems. They understand why a user is highly affected based on the organization of the system. And I think, at the end of the day, like most journalists even would probably say, they're biased towards like Western style democracies because they believe that they're aligned with human freedoms. So then sort of the next argument that sort of becomes something that I think becomes sort of logical is that, well, if Bitcoin ensures human rights to a greater degree than Western style democracies, and, you for whatever reason are someone who is aligned with those in most cases, why do you not support Bitcoin? Because Bitcoin actually is more aligned with human freedoms. I think and again, I think that's an argument that you've made really beautifully. Alex Gladstein has done as well. But I think one of the issues with that is that argument is often only made against the fiat system. And I think one of the reasons why is it's very hard to define the cryptocurrency system in aggregate, right? Because it's very new. It's filled with a lot of different projects. A lot of them are, vastly different. Well, I mean, you could debate that point, but, there's like behaviors and patterns and like feelings like within that market that are hard to pin down, right? Like I would say even like when you said other cryptocurrencies have some style of governance. I would actually push back and say, like, most of them, yes, that's true. Most of them do, but most of them, willfully, make that very opaque and have no conscious like understanding of what their governance process is. And that's where I think, if you look at how these systems are developing, I think one, you have to look at Bitcoin as being a different and distinct system from the cryptocurrency ecosystem. I think this article is like an attempt to start defining, okay, well, what is the other cryptocurrency ecosystem? What are the things that separate it? And then is that system problematic, or why would it be problematic? And, as the more that I thought about it, I think one of the foundational things is that I think two things. I think within the cryptocurrency at large, demographic, I think there's a much different attitude towards user rights than in Bitcoin. And I think two, there's a much different attitude towards the market, or the idea that the market is some sort of form of authority. And I think both of those viewpoints are really present in the cryptocurrency agnostic crowd. They really haven't been addressed in any significant way. And even myself, it took me a long time to be able to articulate it like that. So I'm actually excited to kind of sit down and think about that, see where I can kind of tease out those findings.
Okay, well, so let's get into a little bit more of the practical, because I think we've been sort of like talking about it at a higher level and conceptual level. But you mentioned that, there were altcoins where minority rights were sort of not respected, or, incidences where, you might have been, part of a minority that didn't want to do something, but you were forced into doing something that the network sort of forced you into doing something that you didn't want to do. Can you give some examples of that so the listeners can kind of understand what you're talking about?
Yeah. So the classic example would be on Ethereum. Early on, there was the Ethereum Classic split. Essentially what happened is you had a large smart contract, accrue a tremendous amount of capital proportional to the market cap of the currency at the time. Eventually, that smart contract was exploited by an unknown attacker, and the community at that time put a lot of political pressure on the developers and the various members of the ecosystem to act in some way, right? And I think what was really clouded at the time, and the more that I've sat with that event, I think the more confusing and morally dubious it becomes, like the more you think about it, is essentially what happened is a group of people who felt, that their rights of the users of this contract were more important than other people, as they essentially petitioned, the network or the market, or however you want to call it, and essentially argued that this user's rights should be removed, right? So this individual who exploited the contract, who rightfully claimed money, right? Like now owned the money through for whatever reason, right? He was the holder of the money, and they chose to invalidate his rights. And so I spent a lot of time like kind of reading like the literature again from that period. And I think what was interesting to me, and this is where I sort of started going down that rabbit hole of like, okay, maybe the market is really where this comes in. And you find that the justification for that was really, let's just let the market decide. We'll just let the market decide whether this individual should have the right to the money that they hold. I think when again, at the time when I was reporting on it, and certainly it was happening in real time, I don't even know if many people sort of saw it that way, to the extent that it was, that was the lens to view it. I don't know how widely articulated it was at the time, but look, that's common with, historical events, is that, sometimes we'll find with time that we gain new understanding of things. And I think that the more you look at that event, and now we have two chains. We have the Ethereum blockchain and the original Ethereum blockchain, which continues as Ethereum Classic. And the people who chose to continue supporting that individual's right to their money, that they had, continued to live on another blockchain. So essentially, the cost was imposed on them to essentially start another cryptocurrency. They had to continue and actually convince enough exchanges to list this coin and create a new economy around it. So you start to like really think about, okay, well, what does that mean? Well, it's sort of akin in like, if let's just say every time someone used Bitcoin in a ransomware attack, you would have a large amount of stakeholders try to lobby to invalidate that action, right? I think the excuses at the time that were sort of given were one, we can let the market decide, which I think says a lot about the attitude of people in cryptocurrency to user rights, right? They seem to think that the market is capable of serving as some authority. And, ultimately, I think that, we've seen how that played out, right? The minority had to bear the cost of, continuing that chain. And essentially, those people who decided to dissent, right? They decided they didn't want to go along with the majority were punished, right? They actually bore an economic cost for their decision. And so I think that's a really interesting event to look at. Some people choose to kind of view it as ancient history, and they'll say, oh, well, Ethereum was a beta project, and they made the argument at the time that, this was a beta project, and, until they completed their roadmap, they had to take extensive circumstances. But I feel like these are all the arguments where, you start to see why there's political forces that work within these cryptocurrencies. Like, if it is possible, if it is true that an incident occurred where some individual within that blockchain lost access to their money, you sort of have to ask, well, how could that have happened? And if the system is sufficiently decentralized, how could such a thing have occurred where someone who has seemingly had the idea that they had some right no longer had it or had it revoked? And I think it's an interesting incident to think about, not because it like broadly happens, but again, because it's possible, right? And I think one of my fears with these sort of cryptocurrency systems is as they get bigger, and as more people opt into them because they're attracted by whatever bells and whistles they have, is they're not going to realize that they're fundamentally entering systems with weaker user rights, right? And I think in the decentralized finance ecosystem, so on Ethereum, they're building all these types of applications. In many cases now, they just purely operate by majority rule, right? Like in many cases, there's an amount of cryptocurrency, and then the users will just vote on things. And in almost no case can you find an example where the majority voted for something and then the minority wasn't sort of like economically punished for that action, right? And so I think the economic punishment is interesting because you get this idea of like, okay, well, is it possible to dissent? Like, what is the value of dissent? Like, if you're always banishing someone from who disagrees with you, then how are you different from a petulant king that is just, kicking someone out of the ecosystem, right? And I think that's what's unique in Bitcoin is you do see minority groups that do dissent. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about this and sort of have come to the conclusion that I think that is a right. I think that is a right that Bitcoin respects. Like within Bitcoin, you have the right to dissent from majority opinion, and that in most other cryptocurrencies, that is not true, and that they almost explicitly function by a form of majority rule. And if they do, you sort of have to start asking, like, how is that different from a democratic system in which, a majority can disenfranchise another majority through political elections and other processes?
Well, it's interesting that you say the market is deciding and sort of like using the language of democracy. But as far as I can tell, whenever they do these decisions, it's not necessarily majority of the number of people that are involved in the system. It's really about the number of coins that they hold. So, and that, of course, skews towards the people that hold a lot more, who tend to have gotten much earlier, or maybe even in a Premine or something like that. So it's not really like even a democracy per se. It's a lot more like a plutocracy where the rich people sort of like rule over everybody else. Would you say that's a fair statement?
Yeah, I think at this point, like I would say that one of the reasons I think this argument is particularly strong is because you could say that if you make the claim that other cryptocurrencies sort of function by majority rule and there is no dissent, I would actually say that's a very charitable way to look at what's going on, because that would to me to be a sort of a steelman argument where it's you'd say, okay, well, these are pseudo-democratic systems that function by the majority of the market, right? You were to make a very charitable case for that. And I think I even say at the end of the article, I think that there will be people who continue to maintain that those systems are new and novel, or that they're even morally superior to systems where, a democratically elected government will make the decision. I just think that that's where it sort of gets... To me, that's the better argument to have, not because what you're saying isn't incorrect. I do actually agree with what you're saying, where in a lot of cases on these cryptocurrencies, it is not a majority of people who's actually making the decision to invalidate the user rights, or that is in a position to do so. It is the majority of capital, right? And that's usually much more consolidated. But I do think that if you extrapolate it further and say, okay, well, what's the best case scenario here? Well, the best case scenario here would seem to be you would be in a place where some sort of majority was able to form, and then, you could make the credible claim that the market, sort of replaces government in terms of being that function by which some sort of democracy is enacted, right? I would think that would be a sort of steelman argument for that. I agree with you that it's in practice not there, but I think the fact to me that the steelman argument of it is so weak is kind of what's interesting. If the best case scenario is you end up recreating sort of the same thing we have with traditional democratic Western style democracy governance, why are you creating another system? Like, well, you've only succeeded in removing the controls that the democratic system put in place. And again, I think most of us while we think that we may think that democracy is not working or that it's having some issues as an idea. I think like most intellectual people think fondly of democracy on the whole as as an experiment in human, relationships that move things forward, right? I know that Seyfedian might disagree with that. You might argue that, monarchies, are the best form of government. But I think most people are, on the whole, I think, sympathetic to democracy and what it was trying to achieve. So again, I just kind of come back to it. It's like, you start, even if you're being charitable to the opponent here and saying, okay, well, at best you've sort of recreated, you've put people's rights to their money subject again to a democratic structure in which their right to their money can be decided by some democracy or some plurality. Well, then what is it exactly that is new about what you've created? Because that would seem to describe exactly the current system that Bitcoin was born out of, or that tried to escape, or that tried to allow people to escape.
And I think that's a great way to frame it. And it is very much a system that, even at its absolute most charitably interpreted form, is still not any better than the current system that we have. And at its worst, it's actually much worse. So, like, I know you're trying to be charitable and steal money and stuff, but like, if you weren't being especially charitable for the sake of argument, is the altcoin system better than, say, central bank backed fiat money? Like, what's your opinion on that? Like, not steal money.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, I don't know. I don't actually have a significant developed answer to that. I don't think. I don't think that I'm a person who felt myself very politically inclined towards libertarianism as a whole, right? So I think the way that I would answer that is I think a certain amount of people who came to Bitcoin and then got interested in cryptocurrencies, I think they were sort of looking for a market-based system of rule. So I think from more of an angle as like a historian or someone who like tries to parse broader sociological happenings within the cryptocurrency sector, to me, I think it sort of, I think you would have had this outcome anyway, right? Or it almost becomes a little bit more understandable where, Bitcoin sort of emerges. It is this new system. We can actually, through you running software, you can instantiate your own right to your money. And I think, if you look at the really early user groups of Bitcoin, you only really have three groups. You have sort of open source video game developers. You have, middle management type software people from mostly the Western world, the United States and Western Europe. And then you have, your early libertarian, like US, style Ron Paul and the Fed type, supporters of Bitcoin early on. And I think they were always people who were predicated to this idea that, that markets, the free market, right? That people think in a perfect world, like, you would leave things up to free market. I don't think I was ever really appealed to me. Certainly I've become a lot more of a proponent of free markets, just seeing how Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies have evolved over the years. But I think I would answer that question by just saying that, one, I think it makes it a little bit more understandable for me. I don't know if we can come to the conclusion that it's better or worse than central banking. I think that certainly you could argue that at least the fiat system, again, the perspective is the chips are easy to follow, right? Like we elect leaders make decisions, and we assume that those decisions are made in our interest. That is essentially defining how the democratic system works. You can argue whether or not that is what occurs, but I don't think you can argue that that is conceptually what it is designed to do. So my argument then would become with cryptocurrencies is, what is it conceptually designed to do? And like, what is it doing? And I would say that in that case, it becomes a lot more unclear. I think the cryptocurrency industry sort of exists in a way. And again, I think you can look at their attitude towards user rights, right? I think people felt restricted by Bitcoin, and therefore they assumed that in order to have more freedom with their money, they needed to create other systems. So I think the cryptocurrency space, apart from Bitcoin, it sort of suffers from this weird fallacy of, I should be able to do whatever I want with my money. And if you infringe on me, you're immoral. And that sort of was what happened, I think, during the years when me and you were sort of coming up in the industry. And it was, there was all this, allegations of whether we should fork or how these communities should be managed. I think it was the default lens of the conversation was always about, it's my money and my right, and I have choice. And the cryptocurrency community, I think, evolved to enable that variety of choice and to also align with people who felt that that was morally good. I think that what was never really entered as a counter argument is that in order to do that, people had to give up rights, right? They gave up to exit Bitcoin. You're giving up your right to the money supply and the known money supply, the known issuance, but people don't view it that way, right? Again, it was more the immediate satisfaction of you being able to enter a DApp or a smart contract that you were interested in. So I don't know if that answers your question. I think I don't know if I have a firm answer to that. I think how I can answer to that is it makes me troubled about the cryptocurrency market because it makes me aware that it's vague. It seems vague or willfully obfuscated, or that, I don't know. It's just, I think me and you talked about this as well, where one of the critiques of communism was just sort of this idea about there being an error of feeling with communism, where just something felt wrong and how it encouraged, the populace to, overthrow the government and redistribute property, right? And that was the foundation on which it was based. And I think to me, when I look at that and I look at the cryptocurrency market, it feels wrong. It seems like it's, you have this system and where, sure, you can do all these things with your money, but it often comes at a cost of people trading away rights that Bitcoin grants them. And I don't think they're always conscious of those rights. And then that troubles me.
Yeah, I think maybe the way to sum up what you just said is that conceptually, altcoins are kind of like market driven, like you said. It's the market makes the decisions, or like kind of tyranny of the majority, if you will.
Well, I think they think that the market is moral. It allows them to. It's just the presence of a market, does that somehow make a choice less moral, right? So the fact that the market decided to revoke the person on the Ethereum blockchain's right to their money, how is that more moral than a government doing that? If you're okay with the government doing that, why are you okay with the market doing it? Or sorry, if you're not okay with the government doing it, why are you okay with the market doing it? It's the same activity. You're just obfuscating the responsibility for it. You're just distributing the responsibility amongst more people. The action that you're taking is still negative to the individual. And arguably, you've decided to take away their rights.
Well, so conceptually, that's, I think, what you're saying. And that's sort of like the most charitable interpretation. But having, I was around at the time and I was reading everything and watching everything. It wasn't played out that way. It was most of that market was just waiting on bated breath to see what Vitalik would say. And based on what Vitalik wrote, it wasn't clear which way he was going to go, whether he was going to preserve the code as law principle or not. And I still remember watching a video of a guy explaining, okay, well, if Vitalik says this, then I'm going to support him. If he says the exact opposite, I'm also going to support him. And, it very much became sort of like this, everyone is looking to Vitalik to figure out how they should feel kind of thing. It was a very weird kind of mentality to me, which was okay, well, you don't have an opinion. You're only just sort of they almost felt like sports fans, it's whatever my team does, it was the right thing to do, right? If they released a player, that guy was a bum. If they kept him, he's going to be a superstar. That's how it felt to me when I remember watching it. So the conceptual sort of desire and the actual reality on the ground of what actually happened, I think you can argue were pretty different, and how it actually played out essentially was very much like a dictatorial, benevolent dictator kind of thing for that particular incident, at least.
Well, I think there was a lot of naivete at the time, right? I think that, again, trying to use empathy here, I do think that, people felt restricted by what was happening with Bitcoin. Something was going to come out of that. What came out of that was Ethereum. And I think that, I think this still pervades Ethereum today, as I still think they like to conceive of what they're doing as something that is not Bitcoin. I still don't agree with that. I prefer to look at Bitcoin and the cryptocurrency market. My preferred lens would be to look at Bitcoin and the cryptocurrency market at large as competing financial systems, and almost to divide them there, and to say that, okay, in one of these financial systems, you have a clear list of very strong rights to your financial property, or even just property, if you want to whittle it down to that, as Michael Saylor and Nick Carter, they'll make the argument that Bitcoin ensures property rights, and I think that's totally fair. And then I think you can look at the cryptocurrency industry, and again, if you look at the large mass of cryptocurrencies, again, they seem to behave in common ways and they have common attitudes. So I think it's sort of about finding what those are. And I think the more that I can figure it out, they seem okay with letting the market decisions. I agree in your specific case that, at the time it did feel like decisions were being made by small groups of people. I mean, certainly people were very deferential to the developers and the meritocracy amongst the developers in terms of listening to those folks. You could argue the same thing happened in Bitcoin, right? When Bitcoin faced its own existential questions. I mean, certainly there were people who within the meritocracy of Bitcoin were more vocal. And, you kind of faced it. And I've spent a lot of time grappling with this question as well as, what happened with Bitcoin and how was authority exerted in the space. But I think ultimately, Bitcoin became a system where dissent was allowed. And I think that is really, if you actually really want to give a lot of credit to the developers, I would spend less time talking about the cryptocurrency developers because I don't think they made the right sequence of choices. I think the more impressive set of choices was made by the Bitcoin developers, who I think at many times could have just made their problems a lot easier by choosing the weaker path of just enacting some popular decision or some popular fork. And they were very early on, I think, to recognize this idea that, I think Adam Back was very early on this as well. He made this argument, I think, during the early periods of the fork wars that Bitcoin was apolitical money, right? This idea that we don't want decisions being made in which, majorities can form and majorities can rescind the rights of other users. There's the famous kind of picture of Adam Back at the Hong Kong meeting with the Bitcoin miners where he's talking about the problems with democracy. I think Adam was always pretty uniquely conscious of this, problem where if Bitcoin was not a system where you couldn't have freedom from the majority, then Bitcoin wasn't a unique thing. And I think the fact that they were able to preserve that when so much pressure, was on them to overturn that, I think we should do more to talk about that, right? I think the right to dissent within Bitcoin is something that not a lot of people have actually even practiced, right? The fact that we had SegWit and not everybody used it. We'll have Taproot and not everybody will use it. And ultimately, that Bitcoin is a system where you can still have your Mercia Popescu's who continue running Satoshi's original client. They continue to dissent. I think that right to dissent is foundational to Bitcoin. I think it makes Bitcoin something else. And I think in systems where there is no right to dissent, and again, I actually even really want to pause there for a second because I really want to spend more time thinking about that word dissent. I actually don't know if it's the right word. I think, you have to start asking about what is dissent, right? Do we even have that in democracies? Are you allowed to dissent, right? What does that even mean? I think what that means is that within Bitcoin, as long as you agree to the consensus of the 21 million Bitcoins, as long as you agree that this 21 million supply of Bitcoin is Bitcoin and that, everyone who the ledger says has Bitcoin owns Bitcoin, that from there you can chart your own course, right? You as an individual can be free from coercion and you can make choice. You can opt in to the structures that you want. So Bitcoin becomes a financial system that starts to feel a lot more defined by consent, whereas past, political systems and financial systems were defined by force. And I think, even if you split them that way, where the cryptocurrency ecosystem is an ecosystem where decisions are made by force and political, collusion and political alignment, and that it continues those aspects of, the fiat system. Whereas Bitcoin is a system of a financial system entirely by consent. I think you start building what's powerful about Bitcoin, and you start talking about the things that I think we actually know about Bitcoin, but are harder to put our finger on because they seem a little bit more collusive. So I've sort of over the last day and a half been thinking about Bitcoin as a financial system of consent. What does that mean? And if other cryptocurrencies are not that, then I think it seems to start feeling a lot easier to just call them something else. And that maybe to argue that they are not equal financial systems to Bitcoin, that they are somehow worse for certain reasons. I mean, certainly I think you could make that argument.
Well, so I think what you're saying is that it's not so much the right to dissent, it's freedom from coercion by the majority, something like that, that is very much part of, altcoins where you can be coerced by the majority, for example, in a hard fork where you can't do the things that were available before the hard fork anymore. Would you say that's maybe a way to look at what you're kind of trying to say?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that what I'm trying to say is that in Bitcoin, majorities can form and majorities can take actions, but majorities can't make you, the individual, do something, right? I think that's what's trying to be expressed. And I think to rely on historical examples again, right? I think there's communities within Bitcoin that resisted changes very strongly, and ultimately the core developers sort of had to make a decision, right? If you and the core developers, I think, really had to look at the situation and say, like, well, if we choose to invalidate someone's right to Bitcoin, then we are telling people what Bitcoin is. And if we decide what Bitcoin is, does Bitcoin exist? And I think the Bitcoin developers made the more elegant decision. I think, Bitcoin is defined by the individual and their ability or their right to that Bitcoin, right? And I think that the fact that that is irrevocable within Bitcoin, that there's nothing that can happen within Bitcoin for you to be disenfranchised. If that is the bedrock of the Bitcoin financial system, you can clearly state that that's not the bedrock of the cryptocurrency ecosystem. The cryptocurrency ecosystem, again, seems to appear to be a system in which you are constantly your money is at risk from some majority. And if in any case you end up in the minority, you will have to bear some financial cost to continue on your own. I think, again, how morality gets defined in that environment, to me, becomes a lot more hard, because you're sort of saying, okay, it's okay for just imagine you're the individual navigating that landscape, even as you're sort of, defining it like this, you're sort of imagining this individual who has money, and you're constantly sort of at risk to some political force, right? That seems like the system we were trying to escape with Bitcoin, right? So I think I become a lot more sympathetic to this idea that, the reason that we chose the path of soft forks is because it was harder. And it was harder because, you can't, force people to go along with you. You have to build coalitions peacefully. You have to enact change without force. And ultimately, at the end of the day, if nobody wants to use Taproot, you can't make them. They can continue enjoying their rights the same way they would if you never did that, right? And I think a lot of developers found that very frustrating, right? It's easy to see why developers would want to leave that type of system, and maybe we'll find when the history books are written that they did, right, and that they did largely choose to join some other system, and the results of that were, they continue to build other systems that were weaker towards human rights, and maybe there'll be problems there. I can't write the end of that story. All I can do is sort of say, as someone who's been here 8 years, I'm increasingly sort of troubled by it and think that it seems like it's going in a weird direction.
Well, so one thing I wanted to ask you about, because when I read the title of this paper, right, Against Cryptocurrency, the ethical argument for Bitcoin maximalism, when I read that title, I was expecting something about premines, because for me, when I think about altcoins, this is the most unethical thing that you can do. And at least in the 2011 to 2013 era, this was a big deal, right? Like every cryptocurrency that did a premine was almost always dead in the water, because everybody else that was looking at it said almost immediately, what the heck? Why do you get to keep 40%? Well, because I'm the creator. Well, then I'm not going to go on your coin. And of course, Ethereum sort of changed everything by sort of spinning it as, a fund for their developers or something. But, if what you said earlier, the most charitable case is some sort of rule by majority or rule by a market majority, which is really saying rule by the majority of whoever owns the majority of the tokens, then, a premine is much, much worse. This is you're never going to be in the majority as somebody, or you can always be in the minority because there's somebody that owns the majority. So how would you frame premine within the framework that you have?
So I agree with you that technically within the Bitcoin community, that is how we would explain it. But again, kind of referring to arguments and how arguments can be somewhat weaker than we'd like them to be, even if they're technically convincing, right? So I think the premine argument is it's almost immediately dismissed at this point. If you try to talk to someone outside the Bitcoin community about why that's a problem, because it's been such a pervasive thing that's happened in the cryptocurrency community. So I think you have to come at it from another angle. And I think the angle that I'm suggesting is not to use the Bitcoin Bill of Rights thing again, but I think it's an interesting, case of what would that be, right? So you're saying that in an ecosystem in which there's no known issuance and there's no known money supply, and there is no fair distribution, right? You can talk very critically about all those things, or you can just say Bitcoin is a system where you have the right to a known money supply, you have the right to a known issuance of that money, and you have the right to a system in which, that money was fairly distributed. You can start talking about that in a way that's like positive, where it positively compares to what's happening in cryptocurrencies. And I feel like, again, and this is a little bit of criticism of people who I think have been in the Bitcoin maximalist position, is I think we've allowed ourselves, like, while we are right about things, that does not mean that people have to listen to our arguments, right? And I think that I prefer to flip that on its head. Even like the soft fork, hard forks argument, I really, in this article, tried to avoid using that language because, again, I think it comes down to, would you rather participate in a financial system where you had the right to dissent, or would you rather participate in a financial system in which you always had to go along with what the majority wanted, and the majority could force you at any time, if you didn't want to go along with them, to start a new economy, or to start a new application, or to start some new version of the thing that you were doing? I think most people would choose the environment with more freedom. So then I think we need to kind of reframe some of these things. And this is why I've sort of been tinkering with this rights argument, because I do think that, like, yourself and Alex Gladstein have been very successful in, pushing this argument that Bitcoin is a moral financial system. This is really what I think is the narrative that is cresting right now. This is why Bitcoin is cool. This is why Megan the Stallion is giving out Bitcoin. They're giving out Bitcoin because Bitcoin is freedom money, because Bitcoin is this appealing countercultural movement. And they're doing that because Bitcoin aligns with freedom and values. And I don't think while we have done that argument at a really high level, we've only really made that argument against fiat. I think it's time to start moving that argument, and this is kind of the title, like, against cryptocurrency. You start arguing against those systems. Why do they actually provide less user rights than Bitcoin? And that's why I really like, and I hopefully people will continue this and think about it and maybe critique it, but the only way I can really figure it out is that the way to argue against, these systems in which, there is no money supply or predictable issuance is to just say, in Bitcoin, you have the right to that. This was what was appealing about America, right? Like, what was the Bill of Rights in America? Like, was there something special about these things? Like, I don't know. There's certainly values. All we did was codify them and then made people aware of them, right? But now I think most people have a certain reverence for those values. And maybe we just need to celebrate these values a little bit more rather than arguing against these other negative things, right? So rather than arguing about the Premines, you can just say, look, I choose to participate in a financial system in which there's a known money supply, predictable issuance. I don't have that in the fiat system. I don't have that in the crypto ecosystem. That is why I use Bitcoin. I don't want to participate in a financial system where I'm coerced by the majority. That's why I don't use fiat. That is why I don't use cryptocurrency. This is why I use Bitcoin. You have the right to dissent. Majority wants to do something you don't want to do. You will always have your money, your irrevocable right to money. I think that's the argument starts to become a little bit more appealing. And I think it starts to become something that where, you stop arguing about how many people use the centralized applications, and if Dapper Radar, is a reasonable way to look at metrics, right? So, and you start getting to something that's more relatable to people. Because again, I think that is what you and Alex have done really well, is you really laid the bedrock for that of, okay, Bitcoin is a financial system, and it's a financial system that is right and ethical and moral, however you want to slice it. And that you should be aligned with Bitcoin because Bitcoin is aligned with you. And these other systems are not. And I think really all I was trying to do here was extrapolate that and say, I get it. I understand why people ignore the cryptocurrencies. It's easy to ignore them. It's easy to pretend that they don't exist. But they're going to continue to exist. And they're going to continue to be around. And, they're going to continue to be enticing to people for the same reasons that they've always been enticing to people. But I think we do have better arguments these days, right? And I think that, look, I've seen some good counter arguments to this piece, right? I think you see the people who trot out, oh, well, you can't guarantee that Bitcoin is, never going to hard fork. There could be, this situation where there's some cataclysm, that'll happen, and you can never guarantee it. But look, I mean, with any human aspiration that is significantly beneficial to us, you can never guarantee anything. You can never guarantee that democracy was going to exist. I mean, people didn't know that Abraham Lincoln was going to hold an election during a war, and that democracy was going to succeed from that. So Bitcoin ultimately is just the next best human endeavor to ensure freedoms. And maybe there is no way we can guarantee that it will be upheld forever. It doesn't make the aspiration towards it less relevant.
Interesting. Well, so I have to ask you, because you are talking about sort of like against cryptocurrency and you're making sort of a more positive case for Bitcoin, saying you have these rights and so on. Of course, the flip side of that is showing, I think, that these other coins do not. And explaining that, of course, can be a little bit of a headache. What's your view on Bitcoin toxicity? Because that's something that's come up recently. And really, that's, at least from my perspective, what that is all about. It's saying, okay, these other things are, definitely take away your rights. And I don't know if they would necessarily frame it that way.
Yeah, but being very charitable, that's very charitable.
But that's ultimately the idea, is to sort of ward people away from altcoins instead of, say, your approach, which seems to be more about attracting people to Bitcoin.
I don't know about that. I mean, look, I love Bitcoin toxicity. I feel like I'm one of the people who most loves Bitcoin toxicity as an idea or movement. Yeah, I mean, it was certainly something that really, for me, was really formative, right? I was critiqued and yelled at by people and bore the brunt of toxicity for a while. But I think that, look, ultimately, if you don't have the humility to sit with somebody and understand what their claims are, that's a personal decision on you. But yeah, look, I would say Bitcoin toxicity, I mean, you have to understand where it comes from. So, I do a lot of work, parsing through the Bitcoin archives and trying to develop who the historical figures are within Bitcoin. And I think when you look at Bitcoin toxicity, it really comes from what we've been talking about, is that early within Bitcoin's history, it wasn't clear that Bitcoin was going to be a system that so strongly respected user rights. And it wasn't always clear that there were inherent moral hazards with some of the ways that we could develop Bitcoin, right? And I think that while other cryptocurrencies fell for those things, Bitcoin did not. So Bitcoin toxicity really comes out of, I think, a very small minority group within Bitcoin that was part of this IRC forum called Bitcoin Assets. And I think they were very strong in understanding early on that, the developers within Bitcoin were an authority force. They were using their authority to, impose on other people what they thought Bitcoin should be. And, their reaction to that was to become very hostile to those people. And, the most famous incident I think of that group was when they threatened to kill one of the Bitcoin developers and put out a bounty for them. Certainly that was a very, trying time for the community. But I think what it said was, and when I look at that event in retrospect, I look at, there was a group of people who said, I will challenge you. If you take away my rights, you have to invalidate Bitcoin. Bitcoin does not exist if you take away my right. And I will harass you and challenge you as much as I can, because ultimately Bitcoin gives me that freedom. And if you choose to take away that freedom, then you've chosen to destroy Bitcoin. So I think Bitcoin toxicity is the celebration of what it means to be in Bitcoin, that you can't be disenfranchised, that whatever your actions are as a human, there is no one who can take it away from you. So I think, viewed through that lens, right, you look at what happens in the fiat system where people are debanked, deplatformed, and, for all sorts of different behaviors. You saw what was happening with OnlyFans earlier this year. Certainly we've seen this a lot with financial censorship over the years. WikiLeaks was something that happened early in Bitcoin's history. I choose to view Bitcoin toxicity as a celebration of essentially, the fact that the technology makes it that you can't be disenfranchised. And ultimately, I think that, yes, it's, it can be a tough thing to be on the other end of, but, separate yourself from it and understand it a little bit. To me, Bitcoin toxicity is the strongest expression of that right. It's the strongest expression of how Bitcoin provides an irrevocable right to money. It's the strongest expression of the right to dissent, right? You can push it to the limit. You can, within Bitcoin, celebrate your human freedoms, even when it might detest or annoy other people. You can dissent, and that's a beautiful thing. So I personally think the Bitcoin toxicity movement is wildly misunderstood. I think its historical origins are beautiful and fascinating. And, I think that the creators of it are probably some of the least discussed people in the Bitcoin history. And
Mircea Popescu, you're talking about him.
Yeah, RIP. I wrote an obituary about him for Bitcoin Magazine earlier this year, if anyone wants to check that out. But yeah, I'm actually really, I'm still really interested in telling his story. I do think he is one of the great Bitcoiners. And I do think that this idea that Bitcoin is an environment where you have the right to dissent, I think is, heavily indebted to his person. I don't know if you can really say that it's his attitude or his work, because calling it work would be very charitable as well. But yeah, I mean, you had a group within Bitcoin that dissented, and they exist. They still endure. They still run the same code that they've run for the last 10 years. And, I think that makes Bitcoin a different system than other cryptocurrencies at the end of the day.
Well, it sounds like you're working on some sort of article about the origins of Bitcoin toxicity and maybe explaining it a little better than the way it's been framed by altcoiners, as if it's some sort of character flaw or something like that. So I really look forward to reading an article of that nature.
Working on it. There's a lot of archives down there. And it's there's been a lot going on in this market. But yeah, I'm looking forward to present that. Like, look, I try to brand myself these days as more of a historian than a journalist. That's sort of something I'm aspiring to do right now, is to kind of shed light on the people and the places and the things that have shaped Bitcoin. And I almost view this as like sort of a position piece. It's just been stuff that I've been thinking about as I've been going through the archives. And yeah, I don't know. I do feel like, again, going back to kind of the arguments that we can make for Bitcoin maximalism. I mean, there just only are so many, right? We can make an economic argument. We can argue about how decentralized it is, the network is. We can argue about the launch. But I really question like how many people we're going to reach there, right? I think that at the end of the day, economic arguments for Bitcoin are pretty esoteric. I mean, the arguments that it's the most decentralized one are exhausting to be really charitable. And then the launch arguments, they're good, right? I mean, maybe Bitcoin was immaculate, but maybe not, right? But whereas I think the user right arguments, I think you start to like really kind of bring in a couple different things. So you start to bring in this idea that Bitcoin is a financial system. It's not just digital gold. It is a technology that we use as humans to ensure our financial rights. And I think that can be a powerful argument if we continue to shape it, especially because it does speak a little bit more, strongly to what, why really only Bitcoin, right? Because it does feel like the burden is on us to explain that, right? And, if your answer is that, well, Bitcoin is the most decentralized network because the number of nodes and the cost of nodes is low, I mean, good luck. You also have to explain to somebody why this entire market of other cryptocurrencies in which people are making millions of dollars doesn't matter. So I don't think it's going to be really hard to do that. Because again, look, I mean, the cryptocurrency market is this, massive expanse of cantillion insiders who are printing money left and right, giving it to their friends, getting rich, buying NFTs, wash trading those NFTs with each other, and creating this veneer that they're a cool, hip economy where money is emerging from nothing, right? Like, so yeah, I worry a lot about what that turns into, but I think we should treat it with the deference that it is a thorny beast, that it's going to continue to grow, and that, I think the long-term effects of it, I mean, we're just starting to have that battle, right? I think my biggest worry about the cryptocurrency ecosystem beyond Bitcoin is that it gets much bigger and it encompasses a lot more of the financial system before you see some of the, scenarios that we're talking about. Because with user rights, I mean, you don't notice that like 3 days in, right? Like we were talking about, there were plenty of people who critiqued communism early on. Communism didn't fail for like 100 years. It took them taking over whole countries and whole swaths of the globe and imposing that system on people. And if you look at what happened in, Cambodia and Cuba and those types of places, am I saying that the cryptocurrency is going to go in that direction? I don't know. But I mean, it certainly starts to look like a system where it imposes on people some very strange things. And I think, I hope this piece encourages more people to start asking questions about that system and really how it functions and what it's trying to do.
Well, so one last question I want to ask before we kind of wrap up here. But you were kind of instrumental in a lot of this stuff. I still remember seeing you at like Consensus Invest in 2017. That was a whole conference full of people that were looking to launch their own altcoin. I think at the time it was mostly ICOs. Do you regret some of the stuff that you did to sort of encourage a lot of that? Or like, how do you look at your past when you sort of like come out on this end sort of with this article?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what gives me a lot of empathy, and I get frustrated with the different entrepreneurs in the industry. So Jimmy's referring at the time where I was editor in chief at CoinDesk, and CoinDesk was a small publication of just a few people before it grew pretty widely. I was actually in the room where we asked whether CoinDesk should cover Ethereum, and I actually was the one who argued that point and push that forward. So, yeah, I mean, I think that most businesses within the cryptocurrency community, and I think this helps from a Bitcoin perspective to understand as well, is that businesses inarguably benefit from there being more cryptocurrencies. There's just no way to slice it. This is one of the reasons why you've seen the major exchanges, go the path that they have, and why you see, a lot of the different financial services providers, the wallets and things like that. It was just very hard to make the case from a business perspective. This is why talking about incentives, right? You talked about journalists and why has there been a failure of journalism to understand Bitcoin and to cover Bitcoin. I would argue that there's been an equally large failure from the entrepreneur class to understand Bitcoin and to build things within Bitcoin that add value to Bitcoin. I would actually question how many Bitcoin entrepreneurs there even have been. Or, I was just in a Bitcoin Twitter Spaces with Udi Wertheimer, and I think it sort of ended with, a real substantive question about like, what does it mean to build on Bitcoin, right? And I don't think we know that answer yet, right? I think that certainly there's been a lot more. It's easier to understand why entrepreneurs do other things in other cryptocurrencies. It's a lot easier, right? I mean, you have the ability to print money, issue money, and then use that to subsidize your user growth. So if you have the choice between doing that and driving value to a finite 21 million UTX OSEDs and then increasing the value of it for humanity, it's going to be a lot more appealing to do the cryptocurrency thing. So again, I feel badly about it because I feel like I could have been in a position then to know more. I think that I certainly have done my best over the years to continue to like try to hold myself to a higher standard in light of some of those past mistakes. I'm not sure I would have made any different decisions in retrospect, though I think now that the intellectual reasons for which they were made were pretty suspect. But, I think that, you have to understand that, there was just a lot of, there was this whole veneer that the cryptocurrencies were new and interesting, right? And then I think we didn't know then what we knew now. And if you look at that and apply that to people like Vitalik and Ethereum and the people who have built other cryptocurrencies, maybe they know now more than they did then, and maybe they wouldn't have made the same decisions. And, ultimately we'll see, right? I think what's interesting is how people get trapped in those systems and then they don't make decisions to leave those systems, right? So, I mean, I guess the best thing that I can say for myself is that I chose to leave that system because I was dissatisfied with it and I chose to do something else. I don't think that makes that experience something that I regret. It's always going to be some part of me, like having done that. Certainly CoinDesk continues now with the same value proposition that I helped establish, which is, to cover the, larger cryptocurrency industry. And yeah, I don't know. It's a tough one.
Well, thank you for that, because I think I could definitely tell there's some inner wrestling that you've definitely done with respect to all of this stuff. And
well, I think you have to face it, right? I mean, I think the most thing that I can do is I try to get other people to face up to it as well, right? I mean, there's a lot of other entrepreneurs or people from that era who are like, they see me now and they're like, oh, what are you doing? And I'm, I sort of always ask them like, like, what are you doing? Like, what is your goal? Is like, is your goal to be, the next Mike Novogratz type investor? Like what are you putting forward? Right. So yeah, I think it's, I don't know. I mean, you get into sort of like who's done what and who's a good Bitcoiner. I try to let the work speak for itself and just to continue doing good work. And I still want to do good work for Bitcoin. And I think, I would hope to encourage other people to go down that path, right? It is tough to provide work to Bitcoin. It's very demanding. And I think ultimately that's what makes it rewarding though.
I think the truer words have never been said about Bitcoin and like the difficulty of working for it. It really does have a much higher bar than all of this other stuff. Well, thank you for having been here. Where can people find you? Where can people contact you?
Sure. I'm on Twitter at Pete_Rizzo_, contributor over at Forbes. You can check out my articles there. The most recent one is Against Cryptocurrency, the Ethical Argument for Bitcoin Maximalism. Also contribute my historical research to Bitcoin Magazine, so you can find my work there. And of course, also looking for great developer projects. I do work with the Kraken Cryptocurrency Exchange to fund Bitcoin projects and exciting things that are going on in the open source space. So happy to reach out to anybody who's doing interesting work there.
All right. Well, thank you, Pete. That was awesome.
Thanks for having me, man.
Unchained Capital is the sponsor of this podcast. I'm an advisor to the company. I know the team well, and I'm excited for what they are building. If you need multi-sig, collaborative custody, or a Bitcoin native financial services partner, learn more at unchained.com. Well, that wraps it up for this episode of Bitcoin Fixes This. Pete can be found at Pete_Rizzo_ and BitcoinMagazine.com. Until next time, fiat the Lenda est.